The village of Dambara rested in the hollow of a dry ochre valley, quiet, sun-withered, and far from anything that might change. The roofs were thatched, the air always thick with dust, and the earth beneath the villagers' bare feet held the memory of old things, things that whispered when the wind blew through the maize fields at night. Here, time moved in circles, not lines, and stories clung to walls like shadows. Ish was born on a Thursday just before the rain stopped coming. She was a quiet child, too quiet for some. Even as a baby, she made no noise when she cried, only a slight quiver of the chin, a single tear, and silence. The midwives had exchanged looks then, and one old woman had muttered, "A girl like this, her silence echoes something older than herself." No one questioned it. In Dambara, silence was never innocent. It carried weight. As she grew, Ish's beauty was impossible to ignore. Her skin was smooth as river clay, her eyes the color of burnt dusk, her face calm and unreadable. She did not laugh or argue or interrupt. She helped her mother without being asked, and when she moved, it was as though she belonged to the wind. People said she was graceful, but what they meant was that she disappeared easily. Her voice, when she did speak, rarely rose above a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the air itself. So when Musa chose her to marry, no one protested. Musa was older, respected, a man of wide shoulders and few words, known for leading prayers and building fences that never fell. His smile never reached his eyes, but he brought goats to the bride price meeting, and her father accepted. Ish said nothing. Her silence was mistaken for obedience. But the village did not know what happened behind Musa's walls. They did not hear the sharp sounds at dawn, the crashes that followed, the muffled gasps. They did not see the way Ish's eyes stopped blinking when the sun broke the sky. Musa had a ritual. He would wake her with the back of his hand, every dawn without fail. And still no one knew. No one asked. She never screamed, not even when dawn slapped her awake. Every morning, before the first rooster's cry reached the sky, before the light bled into the thatched edges of the roof, Ish was already waiting. Not awake, just waiting. Waiting for the slap. It came without pause or pity, always at the same moment, like a ritual carved into bone. Musa never missed a dawn. His hand would strike the side of her face, rough and flat, and she would stumble sideways, catching herself silently with her palm against the wall. Then she would rise and begin. The water. The sweeping. The fire. The meals. Her lips sealed, her movements precise, her body obeying like a drum struck over and over by someone who didn't care if it broke. The bruises changed with the weeks. Sometimes they bloomed like flowers beneath her cheekbones, purple lilies, red hibiscus. Sometimes they curled behind her ears like vines that no one had planted. And sometimes they weren't visible at all. They lived instead in her spine, in the way her shoulders curled inward, in the way her hands trembled when she touched anything fragile. The villagers noticed. Of course they did. In Dambara nothing stayed hidden for long. But no one ever asked. They whispered when her back turned. They said things like, "He must be under pressure," or "She probably said something wrong," or "Better bruises than shame." Even the women who scrubbed beside her at the river said nothing. They'd glance at her face, her arms, her sloping posture, and they'd wash faster. Some looked away. One old widow muttered a prayer for her when she thought Ish couldn't hear. But no one touched her. No one dared. It was as if her silence had become contagious, a fog no one wanted to breathe. Her shadow began to change before she noticed. It was subtle at first, so faint it could have been imagined. On certain mornings, when the sun struck the floorboards just right, her shadow stretched slower than her body. When she bent down to lift the clay pot, her shadow's hands would lag, hesitate, like something remembering pain before it acted. She began to watch it from the corners of her eyes, wondering if it was the light playing tricks on her, or if something beneath her skin was starting to wake. As the days passed, the space between her and her shadow grew. Not in distance but in spirit. The shadow seemed reluctant, shrinking at the edges, curling inwards as if trying to protect itself. There were mornings when even before Musa's hand struck, the shadow recoiled slightly, as if it had learned to anticipate violence. As if it were a second self, more aware, more afraid, more alive than she was. Ish said nothing. She continued her tasks. She wiped the soot from her pots and stirred the porridge. But she began walking slower at sunrise. She began pausing before each task. The weight of her own skin felt unfamiliar. Her eyes stayed longer on the ground, not in submission but in calculation. She noticed things she hadn't before, the way the shadows of other women followed them closely, naturally, as shadows should. But hers had a delay, a softness in its steps, like a ghost trying to match the rhythm of a body it no longer belonged to. On the seventh morning, just before the slap came, she turned her face slightly, not to avoid the blow but to see her shadow. It stood behind her, hunched but bracing as if it knew what was coming. And for a split second it didn't move with her. When the slap struck, she felt it, but her shadow didn't react. It remained still, frozen in time. Ish blinked once. Her face stung. Her heart remained quiet. But a thought curled in her chest like smoke. What happens to a shadow that stops obeying? The morning air felt different that day. The birds sang quieter. The wind forgot to rise. And behind her, in the soft sunlight spilling through the open door, her shadow twitched, just once, as if it had remembered something long forgotten. It was market day in Dambara, and the dust hung thicker than usual. The sun glared down with no mercy, turning the red earth into a fine powder that stuck to the throat. People bustled in the square, their feet kicking up clouds with every step, goats bleating in tied clusters, women calling prices over woven baskets of cassava, peppers, and dried fish. But at the far edge of it all, where the noise faded into the humming silence of old things, Ish saw her. An old woman sat cross-legged on a square of burnt cloth, her eyes cloudy, her fingers blackened at the tips. She held a small clay bowl filled with ashes and dry herbs, and with slow, deliberate movements she whispered into it, words so faint they dissolved in the wind. Her skin looked like cracked tree bark, and her mouth moved as if reciting a conversation only she could hear. Ish stood watching, rooted by something deeper than curiosity. The woman did not look up, not until the wind suddenly stilled around them. Then her eyes lifted, pale and distant like moonlight trapped in old water. She smiled without warmth and gestured for Ish to come closer. Ish approached, hesitant. The market sounds dulled around her, as if she had stepped into a separate world. The old woman scooped a handful of ash and let it fall through her fingers like gray rain. "Do you know what ash is?" she asked, her voice rough like bark torn from a tree. "It's what remains when the world forgets to listen. It's memory burned and powdered." Ish said nothing, but her eyes did not look away. The woman studied her. "Your silence is feeding something too long buried," she said, her voice suddenly sharper. "When it wakes, you will not be the same." Ish felt the words like a ripple through her spine. Something in them rang too true, too ancient, like a bell she didn't know had been ringing inside her. She tried to speak, to ask what the woman meant, but her mouth would not open. Her tongue stayed heavy like it feared what might come out. The woman simply nodded, as if she understood even that. "Not yet," she murmured. "But soon." That night the air in the house felt too warm, too tight. Musa snored beside her, heavy and indifferent. Ish lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding with something unnamed. Eventually sleep took her, but it was not the kind that brought rest. She dreamed of fire. In the dream, she was standing in a circle of men, their faces painted with judgment and smoke. They shouted words she couldn't understand. Her hands were bound, and behind her, a stake rose from the cracked earth. They tied her to it. She struggled, but not in panic, in fury. Her eyes burned as she looked straight ahead, defying the crowd with silence more dangerous than any scream. They lit the fire. The flames climbed her dress, then her skin, then her throat. But she did not scream. Her body burned, but her spirit did not break. In the smoke, her shadow danced wildly, refusing to die. And just before the fire consumed her face, she saw herself, another herself, watching from the crowd. Identical eyes. Identical silence. Bound across time. She woke gasping. The dawn light had not yet broken, but already she felt the sting in her cheek. She sat up, touched her face. A bruise was there. Fresh. Tender. But Musa was still asleep, his hand unmoved, his breath loud and slow. She stumbled to the corner mirror. In the faint light, she saw the mark clearly, like a fingerprint pressed by a ghost. A bruise born before the blow. Her hands trembled. Her throat was dry. Her reflection looked back at her not with fear, but with recognition. As if it remembered too. Down at her feet, her shadow shifted slightly, curling toward her like a question not yet asked. Something had stirred. Something old. And it had touched her before the sun had a chance to rise. The mornings did not change, but Ish did. The slap still came as it always had. Musa's hand still struck with precision, like a musician hitting a practiced note. But something had shifted in the space between his palm and her skin, something unseen, thick and slow, like the air itself no longer cooperated with violence. Ish still fell sideways. She still rose quietly. She still cooked his food, washed his feet, swept the floor. But inside her, silence was no longer a prison, it was becoming a presence. Her bruises stopped healing. Days passed, then weeks. The purple-yellow fade that used to come after each blow simply ceased. Her skin remained marked, locked in a permanent display of cruelty, as if her flesh had learned to remember and refused to forgive. The villagers began to glance more often. Some winced. Others grew quieter when she passed. Even the children who used to play near her hut avoided the doorstep now. Dogs barked at night and didn't stop until dawn. Ish said nothing. Musa began to feel it first in the back of his neck. That crawling sensation, that prickling awareness of being watched even when no one else was around. He would pause mid-chew, mid-step, glancing over his shoulder to find nothing but the flicker of firelight or the outline of his wife, quiet and hunched by the hearth. But the feeling never left. It followed him to the latrine, to the well, to the market. He would spin quickly, eyes wide, only to catch his own shadow twitching behind him. Or hers, long and still, too still, in places no light should have reached. One evening, he entered their room to find her standing by the wall, motionless. He grunted at her to bring water. She didn't move. "Did you not hear me?" he snapped. She turned slowly. But her shadow remained fixed against the far wall, a second behind, clinging to the clay like it was nailed there. As she shifted her body, the shadow twitched, then snapped into movement, but not smoothly. It jerked as though resisting, as though caught in something sticky and ancient. Musa froze mid-breath. "What did you do?" he asked, voice lower now, uneasy. "Nothing," she whispered. Her voice was calm. Too calm. Musa stepped forward. The room shrank. He raised his hand. The air tensed. He struck her. But this time his own hand cried out. The sting exploded through his palm like he'd slapped hot coals. He staggered backward, cradling his wrist, eyes wide with disbelief. Ish hadn't flinched. Her cheek reddened with the impact, but her expression remained unreadable, somewhere between exhaustion and warning. Behind her, the shadow didn't mimic her stillness. It remained braced, lifted slightly at the shoulder, like it had tried to block the strike or catch it. Or bite it. "What are you playing at?" Musa barked, sweat rising along his temple. "What trick is this?" Ish said nothing. That night he tossed and turned. He dreamed of cracking wood and crawling smoke. Of eyes staring at him from under the floorboards. In the morning he awoke with scratches across his back, thin and curved like claw marks. He accused her, but she only looked at him without blinking, hands folded, lips sealed. Around the house things began to shift. The cooking pots rang with hollow sounds when she touched them. Musa's food spoiled faster. The chickens refused to cross their doorstep. When she moved, her shadow moved too, but often, it would delay, drag, or ripple against the floor as though it walked through a different world entirely. Sometimes it stretched taller than her. Sometimes smaller. Once, he saw it raise its hand while hers stayed still. He drank more. He yelled louder. But something inside him had begun to rot with fear. She no longer wept. She no longer begged. That silence of hers, once the very thing he had used to control her, now seemed to hum with power. It was feeding on something. Something he couldn't name. At night, he saw movement in the corners of the room even when she slept. The air grew colder near her body. His breath fogged before dawn. The oil lamp flickered violently when she passed. And once, just once, when he dared lift his hand again, the wind outside howled like a dying animal, and his arm refused to rise, like it had turned to stone at the shoulder. He tried to strike with the other hand. This time, as the slap landed, he felt something sharp pierce his palm mid-swing, as though her skin had grown teeth. He jerked back in pain and looked down. No blood, no wound, but the ache was deep and real. A bruise began to bloom in the center of his hand. It didn't fade. Ish turned her back to him and went to wash the floor. Behind her, her shadow stayed facing him. Watching. Its limbs jagged, its outline trembling slightly as if breathing from another world. Musa did not sleep that night. In Dambara the air changed. Elders muttered. The wind stopped passing by her house. And every morning when Musa raised his hand, the silence met him with something heavier. Something watching. Something growing teeth. The path to the village well was a winding one, seldom walked after sunset. Thorn bushes leaned into it like gossiping old women, and the trees whispered secrets in a language too ancient for the wind to carry. But Ish moved silently, barefoot, her shawl dragging across the dry earth like a faded prayer. It was midnight. Not the soft kind of midnight that held lovers and lullabies, but the kind that remembered. The kind that listened. The well stood at the edge of Dambara, half swallowed by creeping vines, its stones older than any living elder. It was said the well had no bottom, only memory. that those who looked too long into it might hear their ancestors whispering back, if they dared to listen. Ish stood over it, the moonlight casting her shadow long behind her. The stones beneath her feet were damp despite the dry season. She stared into the mouth of the well, dark and open like a wound that had never healed. The surface of the water reflected nothing at first, just stillness. But then the wind stilled too and the air thickened. The silence was absolute. Ripples bloomed across the surface. Slowly, faces began to emerge in the water. Not hers, theirs. Women. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. Their faces passed like pages of an unwritten book. They had eyes like hers. Mouths shaped like hers. Scars that mirrored hers. They were not strangers. They were mirrors across time. Their skin held bruises. Their lips were sewn shut by custom and fear. One held a baby. One held a knife. One stared directly at her with such grief and fury that Ish staggered backward. But the water pulled her gaze again. Now the shadows of these women appeared, not behind them but beneath them, deep within the well. Some wept. Some reached upward. Some clawed at the darkness trying to climb. They moved with unnatural grace, like smoke underwater. A few shadows turned their heads to face her. And when they did, the faces above the water vanished. Only the shadows remained, writhing, waiting, watching. Ish's knees buckled. She fell forward, her hands slapping the stone rim, her breath caught mid-throat. A loud rush of whispers erupted from the well, dozens of voices, layered and broken, speaking all at once. We remember. We were buried. You are the mouth. The voices flooded her ears, surged through her blood, wrapped around her ribs like chains of fire. She tried to scream but the sound froze in her chest. The water in the well shimmered like a mirror, and this time she saw herself falling into it. Or not herself, someone else with her face, her shape, her silent rage. That woman reached out and her hand touched Ish's chest. Everything went black. When she awoke, the sky had just begun to blush with dawn. Her palms were coated in mud, her arms soaked to the elbows. She was lying beside the well, half curled like a child lost in sleep. Her mouth tasted of iron. Her shawl was gone. She sat up slowly, breath shallow, and turned toward the well, but it was silent again. So empty. She stood on trembling legs and made her way back through the narrow path, the first light of morning chasing her shadow. In her hut, Musa snored heavily. The fire had died. The coals glowed faintly, like distant stars. She stepped over the threshold and washed her hands. The water in the bowl turned gray with earth. She glanced at the mirror in the corner, the old piece of polished tin her mother had given her. Her face stared back at her. But when she blinked, the reflection didn't. It stood perfectly still. Its eyes didn't shift. Its lips didn't part. It looked like her, yes, but it did not belong to her anymore. Something else had entered. Something else had risen. She turned from it. She no longer needed mirrors to know who she was becoming. The first rooster cried. Musa stirred. He rose, heavy-footed and muttering. He reached for his wrapper, grumbling about breakfast. Ish stood by the fire, back turned, hands still. He approached. The moment arrived. The old rhythm. The slap, expected, practiced, cruel. He raised his arm, same as every day. But his hand didn't move. It hovered there, inches from her cheek, trembling. His fingers shook uncontrollably. His arm refused to obey. His breath grew ragged. It was as if the very air around her face had solidified into something heavier than glass. He pushed against it, but something pushed back. He stared at her, eyes wide. She did not flinch. She did not blink. Behind her, her shadow moved before she did. And this time it took a step forward. The days grew heavier. The space inside the hut thickened like smoke, and the air between Ish and Musa twisted into something dense and alive. The air listened now. It watched. It judged. Musa, once confident in the weight of his dominance, had begun to unravel. The night he couldn't raise his hand left a tremor in him that would not fade. But fear in a man like him didn't birth humility, it sharpened his cruelty. His words turned venomous, his punishments more erratic. He began to strike her with spoons, with firewood, with the back of his shoe. He didn't wait for dawn anymore. He struck when the silence irritated him, when the stew wasn't hot enough, when her gaze lingered too long on nothing. But something was different. Ish never screamed, never begged. But now she no longer shrank. Her body would flinch. Yes, a reflex from years of conditioning, but her posture didn't break. Her hands remained by her sides. Her feet stayed planted. And her eyes, though often lowered, burned with a quiet defiance that unsettled him more than any outburst could have. It was not rebellion, It was a kind of mourning. As if she grieved him in real time. As if he were already something dead. But it was the shadow that disturbed him most. He first noticed it clearly on a morning when the sun rose unusually fast, streaking through the cracks in the hut with long accusing fingers. He slapped her across the mouth for letting the porridge burn. Her head turned with the blow. But her shadow, cast against the rear wall, did not move. It stood tall, unbent, facing him. He blinked. Sweat crawled down his spine. Another day he kicked a stool at her feet. She stumbled, nearly fell. But her shadow, separated slightly in timing, remained upright for a heartbeat longer, then followed reluctantly. As if it had to be convinced to imitate her pain. It began to happen more often. When he raised his voice, the wind pushed against him. When he threw things, they missed their mark. His sleep grew worse. Whispers followed him to the latrine. Birds avoided his roof. One evening, he saw her shadow moving before she did. Leaning, watching, its head tilted ever so slightly like it was listening to thoughts he hadn't spoken aloud. And still Ish said nothing. Not one word. But her eyes were awake in a way they hadn't been for years. Then came the dawn. The fire hadn't caught yet. Musa was in a foul mood. The chickens had escaped again, and the wind had blown dust into his calabash of water. He saw her standing by the hearth, her back turned. A calmness in her that mocked him. He didn't speak. He just walked up behind her, lifted his hand and slapped her with all the force he had. Her head jerked sideways. Her lips split open. Blood glistened, a bright ruby against the dim hut. But her feet never moved. And behind her, her shadow moved differently. It lifted its arm. Slow, deliberate. Musa froze. The shadow's arm extended, fingers spread like claws, and in a movement that defied the laws of flesh, it struck him back. No hand touched him. No body made contact. But the force, the pain, was real. Musa's face snapped to the side. His body spun. He hit the floor with a gasp, his cheek burning, bleeding, his ear ringing like a war drum. He scrambled to his feet, breathless, eyes wild, staring at her. She hadn't turned. She hadn't even flinched again. Her shadow stood over him, long, unmoving, immense. He scrambled out of the hut like a man chased by devils, the villagers already stirring outside. He told them what had happened. He shouted it. Her shadow struck me, he screamed, blood on his face. She didn't move, but it did, it hit me. They stared, murmured, exchanged knowing glances, but none believed him outright. Dambara was a place where stories lived longer than truth. Some laughed nervously, saying he must have slipped or dreamed it. Others whispered behind hands that perhaps the spirits had finally turned against him. A few of the women did not laugh. They glanced at Ish's hut with something closer to reverence. They remembered their own bruises, their own silences. Ish remained inside, washing the blood from her lip with river water. She didn't speak to anyone that day or the next. She did not confirm nor deny what happened. When a neighbor asked her how Musa had gotten injured, she only looked up, her eyes calm but fierce. In that silence burned the memory of every dawn, every swollen cheek, every bone jarred from sleep. And the village, though it pretended not to believe the tale, began to walk softer around her home. The children who used to shout by her door now passed in silence. The men offered wary nods. Her shadow, so often dismissed, so long ignored, had risen. And the bruises on Musa's face were not metaphor. The sun had barely crested the hills when the elder women began to gather, their shawls wrapped tight, their walking sticks carving shallow lines into the red earth. One by one they arrived without summoning, as though pulled by a thread stitched into their bones. They sat in the grove behind the old millet barn, where the trees still remembered how to listen and the wind didn't carry men's names. No drums were beaten. No words announced it. But somehow Ish knew to come. She walked slowly toward them, her shadow long and steady behind her. The air was thick with heat, though the sun had only begun to rise. Flies hovered in lazy circles. The village seemed to hush itself. She found them seated in a wide half-circle, women with silvered hair and wrinkled faces, some blind, others limping, but all bearing a weight in their silence that felt sacred. They had seen more than war. More than famine. They had seen women disappear and still remembered their names. One of them, Nyakoma, the oldest in the village, nodded for Ish to sit. Her eyes were milky with age, but her voice still cracked like firewood. "You do not know us," she said. "But we have always known you." Ish lowered her gaze. "You are her blood," another whispered. The girl who refused to kneel. The name was not spoken, but Ish felt it in her skin, as if it had always lived there, just beneath the surface. "She was your mother's mother," Nyakoma continued, and she spoke truth to the chief. In front of the elders. In front of the men. She said she would not marry him. That she would not lie beneath a man whose hands were blood. And so they buried her for it. Alive. The other women nodded, their eyes heavy with the weight of memory. That day the sky did not speak. The wind did not blow. And the land, our land, began to remember. They looked at Ish now not as a girl, not even as a woman, but as something older, something returned. You were born on the same day, Nyakoma said. In the same hut. Beneath the same moon. It rained that night after 5 years of drought. And your mother, though she was dying, smiled and whispered, "She's come back." Ish blinked slowly. Her chest ached, not with fear, but recognition. The curse, another said, was never a curse. That's what the men called it because they feared it. Feared what they couldn't strike down. Feared what would wait. It was not punishment, Nyakoma added. It was inheritance. Awaiting. A seed buried deep, not in soil but in time. The wind stirred the dust between them, and for a moment, every shadow in the grove stretched toward Ish, reaching gently as though bowing. You carry her rage, the eldest whispered. You carry our rage. The women leaned in now, their voices merging like a song made of sighs. Your shadow is no longer yours, they said. It belongs to all of us. Ish's mouth opened slightly but no words came. She had never been taught this history. Her father never spoke of her grandmother. Her mother died before she could. All she had known was silence. But here, among these women, the silence was not empty, it was a memory. A pulse. One woman placed a gnarled hand over Ish's knee. That's why the bruises do not fade. They are older than you. They are stories etched into your skin. Another leaned forward, her voice nearly breaking. Every time you were struck, she remembered. Every time you did not scream, we heard her breathing. She waited. And now she is awake. A hush fell again. The grove listened. Far in the distance, a hawk called out once, sharp and solitary. Ish rose slowly. The earth seemed to shift under her feet. Her shadow followed, but now it looked thicker, denser. As if woven from the threads of 1,000 others. She looked at it, then at the women, and bowed her head. No words passed her lips, but the elders nodded. They understood. They had not gathered to give her strength. They had come to remind her she already had it. The call for judgment came with the rising of the second moon. Musa, his pride in tatters and the bruise on his cheek darkening like rot, stormed through the village square, shouting of curses and spirits, possession and black magic. He tore at his own robe, threw ash into the air, and demanded justice from the elders. The people gathered slowly, curious, cautious. Word had already spread, how Ish's shadow had risen. How Musa had been struck by something unseen. How his hand now trembled when he tried to lift it. The woman is not a woman anymore, he bellowed, eyes red, mouth flecked with spittle. She has darkness in her blood. She has voices in her silence. I tell you, her shadow is a devil. Some in the crowd shifted. Others murmured. The elders exchanged slow, grave glances. It had been many seasons since a dawn trial was held. It was a ritual reserved for the rare and terrible, the stealing of a sacred cow, the cursing of a rainkeeper. But now they would judge a woman for the movement of her shadow. They agreed to meet at dawn as was custom. The time when truth revealed itself in the full light of the world. The accused would stand. The accuser would make his claim. And the ancestors would decide. The entire village gathered in the clearing where judgment fires had once burned. The elders sat in a wide crescent, dressed in their red robes, staffs in hand, their faces carved from stone. The sky cracked pink above them, birds silent. No drums were beaten. No songs. Only the slow breath of the earth and the expectation hanging in the air like smoke before fire. Ish stood barefoot in the center, her dress clean but faded, her hands folded in front of her. She looked neither afraid nor angry. She simply was. Behind her, her shadow stretched long and still, curling faintly at the edges like smoke around old embers. Musa stood across from her, his voice raised like thunder trying to hide its weakness. She is cursed, he spat. Her own body holds a spirit. I've seen it with my eyes, her shadow moves without her. It struck me like a man. Is that not proof? She is not herself. She has become something else. The eldest among the judges, Babu Temb, lifted his chin and spoke, voice ancient and slow. And so, before us all, you ask for judgment? I do, Musa said, chest puffed. Strike her. Drive the demon from her. The crowd murmured, shifting. Some pitied him. Some feared him. But many had come not for his words, but to see her. To see what would happen. Babu Temb looked to Ish. Do you have words, child? She raised her eyes. For a moment she looked at the elders, then the crowd, then the sky. No, she said. Soft but clear. The silence that followed was alive. Musa took a step forward. Then let the truth show itself. He raised his hand. The crowd tensed. The slap landed hard across Ish's cheek. Her head snapped to the side. But her feet didn't move. And her shadow did not wait. It rose, not quickly, not violently, but with the certainty of something ancient waking from a long sleep. It lifted its hand, mirroring Musa's. And it struck him. The sound cracked through the morning like thunder. Musa stumbled back, stunned. The shadow followed. Another slap. He shouted in panic. Tried to run. But the shadow moved faster. It struck again, harder. Again. Again. Invisible hands crashing across his face, his chest, his pride. He wailed. Fell to his knees. His mouth opened to curse, to scream, but no sound came. His voice was gone. He reached for his throat, his lips moving uselessly, forming words that would not rise. His hands clutched at his own mouth like a child choking on nightmares. He fell to his side, gasping, stunned into the very silence he had forced on her for years. The crowd stood frozen. The elders did not move. And Ish, she did not blink. Her shadow continued. Not in rage. Not in vengeance. But in rhythm. Like a drumbeat long denied. Like memory made flesh. Then slowly it paused. Turned its head. For the first time it looked out, not at Musa, not at Ish, but at everyone. The entire village stared back, breathless. And then, before their eyes, the shadow began to rise higher, separating from her body. Its shape lifted an inch from the ground, still connected at the feet, but untethered at the head and shoulders. It shimmered, no longer bound by the laws of light. It was black and sharp, but alive, carrying the outlines of every woman who had ever kept her pain behind her teeth. For a moment, it stood taller than the trees. Then slowly, gently, it lowered itself. It curled again at her feet like a cloak returning to its owner. Ish took a breath. She turned and began to walk. No one stopped her. Not the elders. Not the men. Not the whispers in the trees. She passed through the crowd and they parted for her, not out of fear but awe. In her silence walked 1,000 voices. And behind her, her shadow followed, loyal not just to her body, but to every story that had ever been silenced before it could scream. The wind shifted in Dambara. Not with noise, not with storms, but with stillness. It was the kind of change that arrived without footprints, without warning. The kind of change that could only be felt in the weight of silence when a man raised his hand, and slowly lowered it again. Months passed. The bruises faded, not just on Ish's skin but in the air itself. No more muffled cries behind walls. No more prayers whispered into cooking pots. The sounds of slaps at dawn, so common they had become part of the morning, disappeared entirely. And in their absence something else grew. Stillness, yes, but also breath. The women stood taller now. They walked slower, with dignity, as if the ground beneath them remembered their mothers. Their laughter was cautious at first, soft and unfamiliar like a language being relearned, but soon it returned in full, as if it had been waiting in the corners of their mouths for years. Even the way they looked at each other changed. In the market their eyes met without fear. At the river, their hands worked quickly but freely, sharing glances that held more history than speech. Children watched their mothers and noticed things they hadn't seen before. Strength in posture, fire in stillness. And the men? They began to fear the mornings. Not all, some still carried their pride like a shield, but none moved quite the same. There was hesitation now. A pause in the hand before it reached. A cold shiver in the voice before it raised. It wasn't just Ish they feared, it was what had stood beside her. What had risen in her silence. No one had seen Musa since the trial. Some said he left the village in shame. Others said he simply stopped speaking and wandered into the hills. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was the echo he left behind, an absence shaped like a warning. As for Ish, she did not return to the hut where the slaps had lived. She moved into her grandmother's old place, the abandoned one at the edge of the millet fields. She cleaned it herself, hauled water, fixed the thatch. No one helped. No one dared. But they watched. She planted herbs outside. She left bowls of ash on her windowsill. And she walked freely. Through the village paths. Along the market rows. Into the hills. Wherever she wished. Children watched her pass with wide eyes. Some of the braver ones smiled. She never spoke much, but her silence was different now. It did not carry weight. It carried power. Her shadow no longer trailed behind her. It walked beside her, matched her step for step, shoulder to shoulder, like a sister or a sentry or an oath kept. Some mornings, if you watched closely, just as the sun slipped above the valley and painted the huts gold, you might catch a flicker of her face softening. Just a breath, just a second. A smile, small and quiet, like a scar healed over. Not everyone noticed, but the women did. And the whispers? They died too. Not from fear but from truth. There was nothing left to whisper about. The story had already been told. The echo already answered. What words remained were spoken aloud or not at all. And the beggar woman, the one who whispered to ashes and wind? Gone. No one saw her leave. No one knew where she slept. Only a circle of soot remained where she once sat, just outside the market wall. The stones were scorched black. A thin line of gray drifted into the soil. Some say she was never truly there. Others say she still is, just quieter now, like a fire buried underground, waiting for the next girl born beneath the wrong moon. But Ish keeps walking. And wherever she steps, the earth no longer forgets. Years passed as they always do. The wind still carried the dust of Dambara across the fields, the seasons still turned the leaves brittle with dry months and heavy with rain, but something deeper had shifted, something the land remembered even when the people pretended to forget. Girls were born and they were named Ish. Not by accident. Not in quiet. Their mothers spoke the name aloud in birthing huts and under moonlight, like a spell passed from mouth to mouth, hand to cradle. It meant gift once or silent one, depending on who you asked. But now it meant something else. It meant the one who stands. It meant the one who does not flinch. It meant the one who walks with her shadow, not behind it. There were dozens of little Ishs now, playing in the dust, shouting under mango trees, arguing over river stones. Their laughter rang freely through the village as if carried on winds older than grief. They knew the story. Everyone did. Not from books, not from fireside retellings, though those existed, but from the way their mothers looked at them when they cried, or when they stood up after a fall. The story was in their bones. It had become part of the village's blood. Near the old well, once feared, once whispered about with dread, now stood a shrine. Not a towering monument of carved gods or fearsome warriors. No gold. No drums. Just a low circle of white stones, with a single figure made of black clay in the center. A woman, not weeping, not kneeling but standing, arms at her sides, chin lifted. Behind her, carved into the ground, a shadow raised its hand, not in threat but in answer. There were no priests. There were no rituals. But every year on the longest dawn women gathered there. Barefoot, heads unbowed. Some old. Some barely more than children. Some carried their daughters. Some brought nothing but silence. They would circle the shrine just as the sun cracked the earth with its first light, and they would walk, slowly together, with their shadows stretched before them. Some cried. Some laughed. Some walked with fists clenched. But all of them walked. They said no words. They needed none. The act itself was enough. It was a remembrance, a vow, a song their feet wrote into the dust. We rise. We walk. We do not forget. And on the hill above Dambara, in a small house made of quiet stone and warm thatch, Ish still lived. She kept to herself. Grew bitter herbs in clay pots. Collected wind chimes made of bone and glass that sang with the changing of the seasons. She went to market sometimes. She was greeted with respect always and fear sometimes, but she returned few words. She had become the kind of woman children stared at and then looked away from, hearts quickened without knowing why. Some called her witch. Others savior. A few even claimed she was no longer fully human, that the thing that had once stood behind her had now become her. She never denied it. She never confirmed it either. She did not speak often. But when she did, it was thunder. Not in volume. In truth. Her voice carried the weight of silence long held, pain long buried, strength long misunderstood. She used it only when needed, once to stop a beating behind a neighbor's wall, another time to break a drunken man's bottle mid-curse with a single word. The stories grew. That she could read shadows like books. That she dreamt of every woman who had ever been hurt in silence. That her reflection no longer followed her, it waited ahead of her. But Ish never corrected anyone. She had become less concerned with stories than with roots. She tended the earth. She drank bitter teas. She stood at her door at dawn and watched the sky with eyes that remembered too much to ever close completely. And when she walked, her shadow still moved beside her, never behind. Sometimes if the sun hit just right, it looked like more than one shadow. like dozens or hundreds all layered, following her stride, breathing with her. The children said her shadow shimmered. The elders said it flickered like fire. One man said it looked him in the eye once and he couldn't sleep for days. But no one touched her. No one dared. And why would they? She had been struck too many times to not know the weight of her own name. She had burned too long to ever cool completely. The shrine by the well was not just hers. It belonged to every woman who had ever swallowed a scream, and every daughter who might one day be asked to do the same. But even still, it began with her. With the silence that had once been mistaken for weakness. With the shadow that had once cowered and now stood upright. And on the longest dawn of the year, when the sky turned gold before it remembered to turn blue, someone always saw her walking just beyond the fields. Alone. Upright. Slow. Unapologetic. Her face unreadable. Her eyes holding the memory of bruises, not the bruises themselves. And just for a moment, as the sun finally tipped into full light, a smile would brush the edge of her lips. Not soft. Not sweet. But earned. Because she had survived. Because she had transformed. Because the morning belonged to her now. She was slapped every dawn, until her shadow learned how to rise before the sun.